beneath Alaska's North Slope, in a place that's been mapped, drilled, and studied for over half a century, the United States Geological Survey just confirmed something that should be front-page news. In June 2025, the USGS released an updated assessment. Roughly 14.5 billion barrels of undiscovered, technically recoverable oil sitting beneath federal land in Alaska. That's not a typo, and it's not a rounding error. It's nearly half of all the undiscovered federal oil in the entire United States, concentrated in one state, in formations that have already proven they work. The United States has now identified more untouched oil in Alaska than Saudi Arabia produces in an entire decade. So why hasn't anyone drilled it? The answer isn't geological. That's what makes this story different from most oil stories. Usually the question is whether the resource exists at all, whether the rock, the heat, the timing lined up. Here, that question was answered decades ago. The real question is why identified oil, sitting in known formations, under a country that still imported an average of 6.2 million barrels of crude a day in 2025, remains untouched. That number matters, because energy independent doesn't mean zero imports. It means not being structurally dependent on other countries for a resource you could be producing yourself. The United States now produces more crude oil than any nation in history, over 13.5 million barrels a day, and it still imports millions more every single day, in part because a known, proven, already connected to a pipeline reserve in Alaska sits legally frozen. Independence, in other words, isn't a resource problem. It's a can we get out of our own way problem. And Alaska is the clearest test case of that in the entire country. To understand why, you have to go back to 1968. That year, geologists drilling an exploratory well on Alaska's North Slope hit something enormous, Prudhoe Bay. At roughly 13 billion barrels, it became the largest conventional oil discovery in American history, and it proved something critical about the geology of the region. The North Slope wasn't a long shot. It was a working petroleum system, source rock, migration pathways, and traps, all lined up correctly. The same fundamental mechanics that built every major oil province on Earth. Prudhoe Bay wasn't luck. It was proof of concept. Pipelines followed. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline System came online in 1977, and for a while, Alaska supplied close to a quarter of America's domestic oil production. The state built its economy around it. The infrastructure was there. The geology was confirmed. And just to the east of Prudhoe Bay sat a stretch of coastal plain that geologists suspected held even more. That stretch became the center of a fight that has now lasted over 40 years. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge was established in 1980, and within it, Congress carved out a specific 1.5 million acre section, known simply as the 1002 area, and deliberately left its fate undecided. Not protected, not opened, suspended on purpose, pending further study and future legislation. Geologists estimate that section alone could hold more than 10 billion barrels of recoverable oil based on formations that share the same basin architecture as Prudhoe Bay just to the west. For 4 decades, that single, undecided sentence in a 1980 law has been fought over in almost every Congress since. This is where the story stops being about geology and starts being about timing, not geological timing, but political timing. Because just like a hydrocarbon trap has to form at exactly the right moment relative to migration, or the oil never gets caught, a drilling authorization has to survive an entire chain of shifting administrations, legal challenges, and lease cancellations to ever become an actual well. In 2017, Congress passed legislation opening the 1002 area to leasing for the first time. A lease sale followed in January 2021, in the final days of the outgoing administration. 9 tracts were leased, but within months, the new administration suspended those leases pending further environmental review, and by 2023, most of them were formally canceled. The oil hadn't moved. The rock hadn't changed. The system that had already been proven at Prudhoe Bay was still sitting there, unchanged. But the legal and political structure required to reach it kept collapsing before drilling could begin. That's the pattern across federal Alaska more broadly, not just ANWR. Leasing plans get finalized, then narrowed. Permits get approved, then challenged in court. Pipeline right-of-way corridors get authorized, then relitigated. Each administration essentially resets the clock, and each reset pushes recoverable oil further out of reach, not because it stopped being recoverable, but because the window to actually go get it kept closing before the drilling equipment arrived. It's worth being honest about why the opposition exists, because it isn't irrational. The coastal plain is calving and denning habitat for the porcupine caribou herd, which the Gwich'in people have depended on for subsistence for generations, and polar bear denning areas overlap with proposed development zones. Environmental groups argue that opening new Arctic oil development locks in decades of additional fossil fuel infrastructure at the exact moment the world is trying to transition away from it. These aren't manufactured objections. They're the other half of the reason this fight has lasted 40 years instead of 4. But set the politics aside for a moment and look at just the numbers, because they explain why this keeps coming back onto the table no matter who's in office. The US still imports crude oil, even while sitting on one of the largest undeveloped conventional oil provinces left in the country. Alaska's oil production today is a fraction of what it was during Prudhoe Bay's peak, partly because that original field is naturally declining, and partly because nothing comparable has been brought online to replace it. The infrastructure, the pipeline, the processing facilities, the trained workforce already exists. What's missing isn't the resource. It's a stable enough policy window for anyone to commit the capital. And committing capital to a multi-billion-dollar Arctic drilling program requires something oil companies rarely get in this environment: certainty that the rules won't change again in 4 years. That, more than the geology, is the actual barrier. You can prove a trap is filled and sealed. You can't easily prove that a lease signed under one administration will still be valid under the next. Major banks have also pulled back from financing Arctic drilling projects over the past several years, citing reputational and climate-related risk, which adds another layer on top of the political one. Even a company willing to accept the regulatory uncertainty still has to find capital willing to accept it too. So the barrier isn't a single wall. It's a stack of them: legal, financial, and political, each one independently capable of stalling a project that the rock itself has already approved. So the honest answer to "Is there oil in Alaska?" was settled in 1968 at Prudhoe Bay and reconfirmed in 2025 in black and white by the USGS. The honest answer to "Why hasn't it been developed?" has nothing to do with whether the oil is real, and everything to do with whether the country can hold a policy steady long enough to go get it. 14 billion barrels don't move, decay, or expire on a fixed timeline the way a biological resource does. They sit exactly where the geology put them, waiting, indifferent to election cycles. The only question left is whether the will to reach them will ever outlast the fight over whether it should be reached at all. Because every year this stays stuck is a year of imports that didn't have to happen. Not a hypothetical shortfall, not a future scenario. Millions of barrels a day arriving from elsewhere, while the American alternative sits fully mapped, fully proven, and fully legal to eventually drill, just not yet. Energy independence was never actually about whether the oil exists. It's about whether a country that already found it can decide to go get it.